All right. Good afternoon. My name is Monty Crabtree, and I'm an associate professor of African American Studies at the College of Charleston. On behalf of the African American Studies program, I welcome you to this year's Conseula Francis Emerging Scholar Lecture. Every year, the African American Studies program invites early career scholars from around the nation to deliver public talks about their research in African American Studies. This lecture series was established by the former director of our program, the late Professor Conseula Francis, who passed away suddenly in 2016. With the blessing of her widower, Brian McCann, African American Studies commemorates her excellence as a scholar and her commitment to mentoring junior faculty by naming this lecture series in her memory. Consuela's research on Octavia Butler, James Baldwin, comic books, and romance novels has left its imprint upon scholarship in a number of fields. She was also the first Black woman promoted to full professor at the College of Charleston, and she used her position and her influence to personally advocate for students, junior faculty, and most especially students and junior faculty of color. We miss her delightful sense of humor and her charisma, her brilliance, and her incredible ability to tell stories, and her knack for calling out foolishness. But we know that her spirit is still in the work that we do both inside and outside of our classrooms. For this lecture series, we invite scholars who rhyme with Consuela's generous spirit and intellectual interests. And tonight's speaker, Dr. Danielle Fuentes Morgan, is no different given her research on Black popular culture, but also her deep and abiding commitment to justice and care and to Black people. And I should also note, she shares Consuela's love for the musical Hamilton. Dr. Morgan is an assistant professor of English at Santa Clara University and specializes in African American literature in the 20th and 21st centuries. She is interested in the ways that literature, popular culture, and humor shape identity formation, in particular, how African American satire and comedy influence contemporary articulations of Black selfhood. Her writing has appeared on Racialicious, Al Jazeera, as well as in Post-Soul Satire of Black Identity After Civil Rights, which is a wonderful edited volume that came out a couple years ago. She's also published in Humanities, Biography, and Interdisciplinary Quarterly, Pretext, a Journal of Rhetorical Theory, Journal of Science Fiction, and College Literature. She has served as the Frank Sinatra Faculty Fellow for the Center for the Arts and Humanities at Santa Clara University, working with W. Kamau Bell and Taye Diggs. Her book, which we're going to be talking about today, Laughing to Keep from Dying, African American Satire in the 21st Century, was published in 2020 with the University of Illinois Press as part of the New Black Studies series and was featured in the New York Times New and Noteworthy Books Review section. Before we begin in earnest, I want to briefly explain the setup for today's lecture. We decided that in COVID times, when attention spans tend to be a little bit shorter, we would forgo a more traditional 40-minute lecture, and instead, I will be in conversation with Dr. Morgan about her book. After about 40 minutes, we will open up the floor to audience questions. So if you have questions, drop those into the chat at any time. Finally, I want to thank Dr. Lisa Young from the English department for so generously agreeing to co-convene the event and manage the chat window. So she will occasionally post links to some of the texts and clips that we are talking about as a kind of annotation of our conversation, including a link to purchase Dr. Morgan's book and a link to a Google Doc with all the links that will be in the chat window in that Google Doc. So to begin, just welcome Dr. Morgan. I'm so glad to have you here. And I want to begin kind of with a big picture question. So what drew you to satire as a way to talk about, among other things, African-American selfhood, resistance, and what you call kaleidoscopic blackness in the 21st century. And I should note for the audience that Dr. Morgan defines kaleidoscopic blackness as, quote, the variety of ways of looking at, thinking about, and asserting one's own Black identity. And as she points out, kaleidoscopic blackness emerges out of the Black interior. So the question again was, why satire?
Sure. So first of all, thank you all so much for having me, for this invitation, and for those of you in the audience for being here as well. One of the things that really drew me to satire was the kind of ubiquity of it all. I initially, when I began kind of thinking of what I found particularly interesting about the 21st century, it was a sense of the sort of absurdity that we've been reckoning with, this kind of in this sort of post-Obama moment in particular, really reckoning with the failures of the post-racial mythology. That it became, I think for a lot of us, when we heard about this sort of post-racial moment that Obama's presidency was ushering in, that was viewed not only with a lot of skepticism, but also with a lot of resistance that post-raciality is not necessarily a band-aid, and it's not necessarily desirable, right? That this idea of post-raciality can sort of muddy the water in terms of making race as opposed to racism the problem, right? And I think that once we had Barack Obama as president and we saw the way Black lives still were under attack and in question, and for many of us, this was not a surprising turn of events, that sense of the real life absurdity of our nation, of the way the nation talks about itself, of the way the mainstream sort of articulates race within the context of the nation, became sort of overwhelming. And as a result of that, in the 21st century, what I'm seeing is a lot of satirists, both comedic satirists and sort of the more horror tinged satirists as well, really struggling with how do you make the absurdity of the real world. If the real world is already so absurd, what role does satire have? And that's what I was really grappling with throughout this. And what I've discovered through my research is the fact that the 21st century is very focused on sort of reimagining frames of reference, and how we might actually think about the power of satire. If the world is absurd, um, you can't necessarily do the same kinds of satirical invections that you would normally do, or that have served in the past, when it becomes this kind of unsustainable space. And so what I'm seeing is a lot of satirists trying to blur the line between the real and the fictional, and creating, in doing so, this new space for talking about what imagining the world otherwise might look like, and that there's power in that, that there's a sense of Black possibility when you start saying this is the surreality of the world. How do I imagine myself fitting into it? And then calling others in your in group into that conversation as well, and saying you're not alone, you're not the only person who's recognizing this sense of absurdity, even as we're supposed to imagine the status quo as never being absurd. I think that 21st century satire is really saying, actually, the status quo is absurd, and it's always been absurd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And can you talk a little bit more about, again, I really like this term kaleidoscopic blackness, and it's kind of the inspiration for the cover as well of the book. Um, and how in particular satire troubles a kind of essentialist, narrow way of understanding what blackness is.
Sure. For me, a lot of the satire in the 21st century is about identifying that status quo and then subverting it.
Mhm.
Kaleidoscopic blackness allows that because it refuses the sort of mainstream concept of what blackness is supposed to be, with supposed to be having huge scare quotes around it, right? This idea that blackness, as it is depicted in the popular realm, often is supposed to look like one thing to be seen as authentic. Now, Black people have always known that's not true,
Mhm.
right? We have always known that there are many ways to be Black, that many ways of being Black are valid. And so this kaleidoscopic Blackness allows us to recognize that there's not sort of one sort of bar for what performing one's Black identity looks like, that there are all of these different ways of thinking about it
Mhm.
and being Black and experiencing, having Black experiences, that all of this kind of taken collectively becomes what Black identity might look like. And this is a really, I think, critical move. And again, one of the things that I talk about in my book, and I want to be clear today in particular, is that what the 21st century does is not necessarily think about Blackness in bold new terms within Black communities, right? Black people have always known that there were different ways of being Black, that all of these ways of being Black are valid. But what we are seeing is a more comprehensive eschewing of a particular kind of performed identity. It's this sort of sense that, um, you are aware of the fact that there are other people out there, that you are an individual within the context of Blackness and within the context of Black identity, but you are also so much a part of this Black community and these Black communal experiences that you can't be distinguished from it, that both of those things can be true at the same time.
Mhm.
And thinking about this kind of the bothness of Black identity, that you yourself are an individual, but also that you are a member of this collective, is where kaleidoscopic Blackness sort of emerges.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's particularly important, given the narrow ways in which Blackness is often like allowed by gatekeepers in Hollywood, for example, or in television executives to sort of look like, and I think pushing back against the narrowness of those images is so critical. Again, because it's not like it's new for Black people, right? It's well known. Um, so I obviously love satire and humor. I share that love with you. Um, and my next book is going to be on the pleasures and ingenuity and expediency of guile and deception in African American culture. And one of the reasons why I am drawn to satire is the pure joy of laughter and the deep satisfaction of unsettling the status quo and pulling one over the more powerful and admiring the cleverness of a joke. So for me, there's a utility to it, right? There's a clear
Right.
political message in it, but there's also like joy and pleasure and laughter. Um, and in the introduction of your book, you describe laughing to keep from dying in the context of enslavement as, quote, laughter in a place of solemnity and trauma, of what would otherwise be social death and dying. It is this laughter that might lead to justice as autonomy, where justice is freedom to be without limitation or oppressive parameters that would punish or otherwise discourage establishing selfhood. So, in other words, to make it through the suffering and despair of enslavement, enslaved people opened up space in their lives for laughter and hope. So, could you talk a little bit more about the role that pleasure plays in this phrase that you use a lot, Black revolutionary laughter, and why laughter is so important in the context of African American liberation?
Sure. One of the things that you already know, that we share this, love of satire, and particularly the joy that is sort of undeniable, even within the context of a lot of these horror satires. I think there's something there, but within the context of um, slavery, one of the things that is so critical to understand is the way this laughter forms this kind of rested freedom, like that this is something where you are able to have these kinds of brief moments of catharsis. And not only that, because of the way we have sort of continuously thought about laughter, or sort of discounted its significance, even as we know the significance of laughter. A lot of the sort of context, I think, of African American satire is the sort of discounting while already knowing it. Um, that laughter in the context of slavery in particular allows this sense of plausible deniability, right? That you can always say, oh, it's just a joke, or I was only kidding, or I didn't really know what I was talking about. I was just trying to make people laugh. And offer yourself some sort of protection as you are punching up, as you are speaking truth to power, as you are attacking people who have more um, cultural capital or literal capital than you do. That this kind of revolutionary space allows you to articulate your self identity with a modicum of protection as well. And I think this is really important because we're seeing this today. I'm always struck by the fact that Donald Trump would spend so much time on Twitter, for example, railing against Saturday Night Live, refusing to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So even Trump clearly knew the power of satire, the power of comedy, the power of the fact that, when these comedians are making fun of him, that this is being disseminated effectively. And even as people are saying, oh, it's not a big deal, it's just a joke, the people are being swayed by this. People are, it's impacting. Part of that, was certainly his own insecurity and things like that. But rightly so, because people were in fact listening to these comedians, listening to these satirists, and being moved by it. And so I think that within the context of Black revolutionary laughter, that's what we're seeing. This tool that you have to create a space for change. Comedy is also really useful in that way because while it requires a great deal of work to perfect it, and it is certainly a craft, it is a craft that doesn't require you're purchasing anything, right? Like you don't have to have um, a musical instrument. You don't have to have, all you really have to do is have the space and an audience. And you can determine what that space looks like. You can determine who the audience is to a certain degree, but that the accessibility of comedy has always been useful from from slavery into the present, certainly, and even before. But during this context, I think that accessibility, that sense that it is available as a tool for so many of us, I think is really critical here.
Yeah, and I think there's also something about, especially behind closed doors, like within the Black community, away from white people.
Right.
That kind of humor within the community is a way to kind of affirm one's own sense of like, this is really screwed up, right? Or like, this is really wrong, right? Or this person is terrible, right? And so there's a way in which there's like a kind of affirmation of what on the outside is like deemed insanity, but
Absolutely.
one knows to be true, right? Um,
Absolutely. That affirmation of your in-group standing so that you know that there are other people out there who get it.
mhm,
That sort of camaraderie that you have with someone when you make a joke
yeah,
and they get it,
yeah,
right? Or even one of those moments that we have all had, and I hope once COVID is over we'll have again, when you're sitting in a meeting, when you're sitting in a classroom, when you're sitting someplace and someone else says something and you catch eyes with somebody who is interpreting it the way you're interpreting it, and they quietly laugh with you. Like you didn't have to say anything, but you both read that moment the same way, and you saw the humor in it, or you saw the fallacy that was made, whatever it was, that
mhm,
you all share that, and then you all are sort of allied. At least in that moment you have an ally. And I think for within Black communities, that is particularly critical. I think for a wide variety of marginalized groups, that's really, really critical, especially when you are in a space where there are very few people like you, or when you don't have that level of power, to have somebody there who you can say, okay, you get it, and I can talk about it, just the way you brought it up, this sense of like, I'm not wrong for feeling this way,
mhm,
right? Or I read this correctly, in a sort of in a way, you know, the title of the book is Laughing to Keep from Dying, but it really is that sense that if you didn't have those moments, how could you survive? How could you survive sort of being, how could you survive the gaslighting? How could you survive the sort of context in which you're consistently invalidated if there wasn't someone there to kind of look and catch your eye and laugh and say, I see what they're trying to do to you, or I see what we both see that this person is wrong. We both see that this, you know, that they're continuing to do this thing they promised they weren't going to do anymore. All of these kinds of things as a mechanism for survival.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to talk a little bit about, we're going to talk about Get Out a couple times, but I want to talk about Get Out here too. And hopefully, uh, all of you have hopefully seen this film. It is a horror film, but it's also like racial commentary. It also is funny. It's also satirical, and it's just brilliantly acted and shot. Um, and so when it came out, it was this box office sensation, not only with Black audiences, but with white audiences as well. And I remember watching an interview with the director, Jordan Peele, on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And Colbert asked Peele if Black audiences and white audiences experienced the horror in the same way. And Peele said, no. I think Black people, you know, it's like the second the movie comes on and the protagonist is dating a white girl, they go, ooh, he's in trouble. It's not until later in the movie that white people get freaked out because they're like, oh my God, I think I said that thing that the villains are saying in the movie. And I've often wondered, in light of this gap between white and Black responses to the horror of the film, if white viewers got the deeper point, right? So not just that they may have said racist things in the past, but that the Black experience in the United States has often been a horror. And I wondered if they truly understood the point of the film, right? That white people admire Black excellence, but revile Black people. And what I'm wondering is, and this is one of the tensions within satire, because it's built on doubleness. It's built on like a slipperiness between the literal and the figurative, for example. Why is satire both such an effective tool for eliciting what you call Black revolutionary laughter, and yet it is so vulnerable to distortion on the part of the audience and misfires on the part of satirists? And we'll get into some specific examples of these misfires, for you know, and these very well done satires in a second. But could you speak in broad strokes about the perils of doing satire? You know, why are there such incredible payoffs when you do it well? Why is it like utter disaster when you do it poorly?
Yeah, this is a great question, and um, Get Out is a great example. I'm thinking now of the fact that Allison Williams, who played Rose, talks a lot about the fact that it is entirely, and she said this in interviews before, that it's entirely white people who come up to her and say, but wasn't Rose a victim too in some way? Didn't Rose, like, maybe she was hypnotized, maybe she you know, was put upon by her family, and that Allison Williams, the actress who played her, has to be like, no, she was the most evil person of them all. Like, you have, that was kind of the point, right? And she's very explicit, you know, it is only white people who come up and ask me this question. So we have that kind of sense. I think you're absolutely right, that Black people, from that first sort of opening frame, when she knocks at his door and we can see that they're in a relationship together, you know, there's kind of that pause. And then when you find out they are going to her family's home out in, you know, out in the secluded area, and her parents don't know that he's Black, I think Black people were kind of universally like, uh-oh, like this is not going to go well. Something is afoot here. Um, I don't know that white audiences necessarily had that immediate sense of what kind of, even if there's the sense of, uh-oh, this, they should probably know this before he comes, they may not have had that same sense of um, horror, the real life horror that Black people have had, having been the one Black person in a white space before, right? Um, and so I think that the risk with this kind of satire sort of broadly can be that you to do satire effectively, the audience has to be aware of what the status quo is, and then they have to understand not only that you're subverting it, but why it's worthy of subversion. And so with Get Out, there is a risk certainly that for white audiences in particular, they understand what the status quo is, they recognize that Peele is subverting it, but they aren't quite certain why it has to be subverted, which is why there's this inclination to say, but Rose must have been a victim too. It couldn't have been, this can't be sort of a broader commentary on race. It's a broader commentary on bad white people, that it becomes, instead of talking about whiteness kind of as a structure or white supremacy more broadly, that it becomes, oh, this Armitage family is very bad. And that's what the horror becomes. When horror movies are always, kind of satirical, they're always social commentary. The thing that's supposed to make us um, fearful is, certainly the monster, but it's because the monster represents some sort of deep-seated fear that we have already about humankind, about, these kinds of broader tropes. So there's always the risk, I think, in a film like Get Out, where um, the racial commentary is at the forefront and you have to understand it, that if people don't understand it well enough and understand why it's a problem entering into the film, they can't understand why the subversion is so necessary as a broader conversation. They can only really see it as sort of this one unique event that took place. Look at this very creepy family in their creepy house with their creepy kids, and oh, this is very bad for this one, this is very bad for Chris, and I'm sorry this happened to him, as opposed to thinking more broadly and saying, wow, this is actually the reason, so many Black people identified with this is because they recognize that sense of unease. They recognize that sense of um, being gaslit. They recognize that sense of hearing people objectify you and commodify you to your face. Um, that moment in the film, even before it, as it kind of incrementally gets worse and worse for Chris, when the party guests are just talking about him and about Blackness and Black people, and speculating about his physicality and his sexuality and all of these kinds of things. Those are real life experiences, even stripped clean of what's coming 20 minutes later, right? But people have to be willing to understand that, and a lot of people aren't.
Yeah, which is why I think the character Rod from TSA is so interesting, because in so many ways he is the voice of reason, and he's also like the voice of kind of the Black public in the
Right,
film,
absolutely.
right? But in the film, he is like laughed off by Chris. He's laughed off by the police, right? But he does save the day, right? So there's a way in which you see how like what seems absurd and insane in the broader public actually being like the moral and a moral underpinning of the whole movie, but also like the voice of reason in the whole movie.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I'm not sure if everyone sees, I mean, he's funny, right? And that's part of it, right? He makes you actually laugh.
Absolutely.
But then at the same time, he's actually like this kind of playing this moral kind of role in the film that might be missed if you're just focused on the laughter, right? Because he
Absolutely.
does have
Yeah.
these great lines.
I think that's such a good point. Like he's not simply comic relief, even though he's a comic character, right? That the things Rod seems so much like somebody like the kind of stereotypical Black audience yelling at the screen. Like, he's
Mhm.
not wrong about any, he's really not wrong, even as he's slightly off base in part of what he assumes is
Mhm.
happening, but not fully, not completely off base. And he is the one, like, he survives the movie and he saves the day. But yeah, this sense that it's easy to kind of, if you're not attuned to what a character like that is supposed to do, it's very easy to just say, oh, that guy was so crazy, it was so funny. And that's not the point at all.
Mhm.
And I think, I am a huge super fan of Jordan Peele now, because of both of the movies and his work with the Twilight Zone. I'm just really excited to see how his career continues to develop. But I think that what Get Out does so effectively is to, if you are paying close enough attention, really reveal to us that, like, our laughter matters, but it matters because it's supposed to underscore something else. It's not, we don't just simply get the payoff of the laughter. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I think that's a really, really hard thing to do. And it goes into that question of, these satiric misfires. It's hard to make people laugh and also make them think at the same time. You have to do a lot of work to ensure that people are willing to do both. And sometimes, even if the satirist tries to do both of those things, the audience doesn't want to.
Yeah.
It's to quote Andre 3000, it's the y'all don't want to hear me, you just want to dance, right? Like, it's the same kind of thing. That people are, sometimes people go to the comedy show and they say, I came to laugh. I don't want to think about this stuff. And if that's the case, the comedian may or may not, the satirist may or may not be able to defeat that.
Yeah. Yeah. So for the next couple of questions, I want to talk about some examples of when satire works well, and when satire misfires. Through a couple of these examples you talk about in the book. So let's start with some of the ones where it works well. For instance, you talk about performance art by Mendy and Keith Obadike, where they put Keith Obadike's blackness up for sale on eBay. There's also Jordan Peele's film Get Out, which you've talked about, and Issa Rae's show Insecure, all of which you talk about in the book. So what made those satires so effective? And what does it mean for them to be effective in terms of like hope for actual liberation?
This is a great question. I think that one of the things that made them so effective is their consciousness, the fact that they were aware. And I have to be careful with how I say this. These were made for Black people while being aware that white people were watching. And that's different. I think there's something fundamentally different with that. That's not just simply being, trapped under the white gaze, right? That it instead is this way of saying, white people are, because of our sort of integrated world, white people are going to have access to this comedy, but I am still sort of unapologetically going to frame this in a way that makes sense for me. One of the things I love about Insecure, for example, is all of these kinds of signposts where you get an even deeper meaning from the show, if you have these kinds of Black cultural touchstones, like the Halloween costumes every season, that, or whenever it's Halloween on the show, that Issa Rae dressed up as one of the characters from Spike Lee's School Days, for example. And there was no comment on it. She didn't explain who she was. She was just wearing that, as that was just what her costume was. So if you knew the Spike Lee film, you knew what she was doing and you knew what that represented. If you didn't, you could still watch the movie, or you could still watch the TV show and enjoy it and have fun, but your experience is heightened from having those kinds of cultural touchstones. And I think that that's a really important move that a lot of these satires are doing, because it acknowledges Black cultural experiences as worthy of being made canonical, right? That it's not sort of the sense, as an English professor, there's an assumption that my students should know, for example, The Great Gatsby, that everyone read it in high school, everybody knows it. And so if I start talking about, an unreliable narrator, and I start talking about Nick Carraway, I'm not supposed to have to do much more than that to explain why he's unreliable. What is often missing in those kinds of conversations is the fact that that there are Black cultural touchstones as well that exist in many Black communities. And so when Issa Rae is making these kinds of moves, that can be really critical, even as a subtle way of saying, this is for my in-group, right? This is the insider knowledge that I have. This is, if I didn't read The Great Gatsby, if that wasn't one of the mandatory texts in my high school, or if I didn't, read it, in my first year in undergrad, or whatever the case may be, that I have other cultural touchstones that are just as important, that Spike Lee perhaps is just as valid as any other sort of auteur or any other, sort of canonical writer that we'd be thinking of here. And so I think that's one of the things that really makes the texts that you've mentioned work so well, is this sense that it's sort of addressing the cultural capital of Black communities, while also allowing, in many ways, interest and access to people who don't have that cultural capital, that at least ideally should not undercut the message that's intended for the audience that does get all of it.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think that I mean, could you talk a little bit more about if you don't mind, the Keith Obadike
Yeah.
sale? Just because I found that to be, I thought your reading of it was really excellent, and I think it gets at how you undercut without reinforcing by mistake, right?
Right.
The kind of commodification of Blackness.
Yeah. So, I mean, with the Keith and Mindy Obadike performance piece, they had an eBay listing for Keith Obadike's Blackness. And you could make bids on it that he was done with it, he was selling it, and you'd get all of these kinds of quantifiable and stereotypical benefits from purchasing his Blackness, which was a very interesting kind of performance piece. What I find even more interesting is the fact that people bid on it. That they bid on it, that the price of his Blackness kept going up until eBay shut it down as, something that they weren't going to allow to be purchased. But that's interesting to me for a few reasons, but the primary one is that Obadike was able to kind of very clearly explain what our presumptions of Blackness are, in a very concise and very clear way, saying that these are the benefits people associate with Blackness, and here are some of the setbacks associated with Blackness as well. The fact that people were bidding on it, I find very perplexing for a number of reasons. Of course, there's certainly the sense that people are, interested in this kind of kitschy idea of purchasing somebody's Blackness. But I think it also really speaks to this sense of continual commodification, this desire to continue commodifying, even within a 21st century context as well.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and so I also want to talk about the misfires that you talk about in the book. So in particular, what you say about Dave Chappelle. So in a few places you talk about his comedy and satire, and you draw this distinction between his Chappelle Show days and beforehand, and then his sort of comeback and to the public eye in more recent years. In particular, you write that, quote, Chappelle's later comedy has suffered from his lack of vulnerability and his association with annually discovered comfort among those in positions of power, end quote. So could you talk more about what has changed in his approach to satire and comedy, and how has he misfired? And also, since you point out in the book that Chappelle and Richard Pryor often kind of, or I guess Pryor is seen as like the antecedent uh, um, to Chappelle. Can you maybe bring some of your analysis that you do so wonderfully in the book about Richard Pryor's sketch Bicentennial N-word, which you sort of use as a counterpoint to the more recent Chappelle work?
Absolutely. So, so with Dave Chappelle, I think most people who are here may be aware of the fact that Dave Chappelle walked away from his $50 million Comedy Central contract in view of the fact that he had a sketch that you can find on the lost episodes. Interestingly enough, those used to be on Comedy Central, and I bring this up on ComedyCentral.com, and I'm bringing this up because I think it gives additional context when I talk about the kind of power Dave Chappelle has right now. All of the lost episodes are no longer on Comedy Central. You can only find season 1 and season 2, and nothing that was recorded, and then nothing that was recorded for the season where Dave Chappelle left. And I bring this up because the fact that Dave Chappelle got his show taken off of a number of streaming sites and was able to sort of selectively choose what to keep up and what not to keep up is an incredible, almost unheard of amount of power for a figure in popular culture to be able to tell a network, I don't want this on your site. And they said, and you know, like HBO, I believe it was, said out of respect for Dave Chappelle, HBO said okay.
Mhm.
um it is unheard of to me. And it's not even a critique, it's just a reality that his life has changed quite a bit. So he left the show, left that contract because he felt um in an episode where he was in blackface, he saw a somebody who worked on the set laughing, and he said it was the first time he felt that they were laughing at him and not with him. He worried that his message was being lost, and he didn't want to do it, and he felt convicted enough that he left. He went to Africa. The narrative at the time was Dave Chappelle went crazy. Dave went crazy. He's gone. He's not coming back. And for about 10 years, we really didn't hear a lot from Dave Chappelle. Then he started kind of trickling back. You started hearing rumors Dave might be coming back. He's coming back on stage. Um, and he started doing these performances. He started touring again, did these Netflix specials, hosted SNL twice. And what has been particularly interesting to me is that Chappelle seems to have a kind of shield up now, that because of what happened so many years ago when he felt he was being laughed at instead of with, and that he became concerned about the sort of message of his satire and that sense of vulnerability that he was sort of exhibiting, that he's decided he's not going to be as personally vulnerable anymore. That what we are seeing with Dave Chappelle, certainly, you know, his comedy has always sort of tended towards the immature. I often describe him to my students as his comedic persona is sort of the stoner slacker, and he's supposed to be like the funniest guy in your dorm. It's very casual, it's very approachable, it's kind of a oh, I was smoking some weed and then I thought of this thing, so I'm going to share it with you all, when we know of course that he's been working very, with laser focus on making his jokes as clear and impactful as possible, but his persona is very different from that. What we're seeing now is much more of a sense of, I'm not really trying to change the world. I'm much more interested in trying to make you all laugh. Dave Chappelle also, because he has become so powerful and so wealthy, he is not able to punch up in the same way he used to be able to, right? When he's already up here, there's not a lot of up to punch at that point. And I think as a result of that, he's just sort of decided everyone is fair game. And so a lot of his comedy um, has started erring on the side of hitting targets that I don't know that he necessarily always intends to hit, but that doesn't negate the fact that he's hitting them. You know, he his jokes about LGBTQ people, his jokes about trans individuals, all, you know, all of these kinds of things, not to certainly imply that he was ever a huge trans ally prior to this moment, but he wasn't, his jokes weren't sort of erring on this side of the kind of harm that he might be creating.
Yeah.
And I think that that comes from um, that sort of pivotal moment where he decided that opening himself up and being vulnerable could not only make him get hurt, but hurt the quality and the sort of target of his jokes, that um, he wasn't able to do the blackface sketch in the way he intended it to be, and so he decided he wasn't going to take those kinds of risks anymore. This is so different to my mind from Richard Pryor, and I think that connection is critical because Pryor, before he died, said out loud and publicly that he wanted Dave Chappelle, that he thought Dave Chappelle was his sort of comedic heir, and that he wanted Chappelle to pick up the mantle. Chappelle, in response to that, specifically said that that was sort of overwhelming, that that was scarier than the $50 million. Richard Pryor sort of saying, you're the next me. Um, and I think when Chappelle started trying to do that and be vulnerable, and then it got uncomfortable for him, he decided he wasn't going to be the next Richard Pryor in that way. He was going to be the next Richard Pryor by winning awards and being very famously funny, but I don't think he wanted to do the same kind of work that that Pryor did. So, for example, the bicentennial sketch that, or stand-up sketch that Pryor does, where he sort of imagines a formerly enslaved person talking about the bicentennial. So, this person has lived for 200 years. They're talking about the bicentennial in 1976. And talking about all that they experienced throughout 200 years as a Black person in the country. And it ends with the person um, voiced by Pryor saying, you know, y'all probably done forgot about it, and kind of laughing. And then the laughter stops and he says, but I ain't never gonna forget. And it's this really powerful moment where he yanks you out of that sort of comedic reverie, out of the laughter, and then his laughter stops, and he says, "I'm not going to forget what happened here. I'm not going to forget the reality of what Black life looks like." Um, I think that is such a vulnerable move, and it takes a lot of courage to do that kind of thing. And I think that, you know, Dave Chappelle right now is not as interested in taking those kinds of risks or being vulnerable in that way. I also think that Dave Chappelle is somebody who is not concerned with the question of legacy right now. I think Pryor at that time was thinking about what is comedy going to look like after I'm gone. I don't know that Dave Chappelle is thinking that. I think Eddie Murphy is somebody who we have seen contemporarily really start thinking, okay, well, what does this look like once I'm gone? You know, apologizing for some of the stand-up he did, making Dolomite Is My Name, that Eddie Murphy is really thinking, okay, what does this look like now that I'm, you know, 60 years old? How am I going to frame all of this? Um, and yeah, so I think that there is that question of legacy and that question of vulnerability right now
Mhm.
is sort of um, because Chappelle doesn't want to address either of those things, he's much more interested in being a comedian as opposed to being a satirist right now. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that necessarily, outside of the harm that you can cause by switching from satire to comedy, because people are still expecting a satirical message, and he may just be doing a comedic message instead.
Mhm. And he has these moments where he kind of, I think, harkens back to the old Chappelle,
Absolutely.
right? And so one of the things that Dr. Young put into the chat was there's two SNL links. One is to the monologue where he kind of excuses Donald Trump in certain ways. And then another sketch that he did in the same show on the actual election night, about the election night, that has these like moments of old Dave Chappelle in them, as well. So before I open things up to audience questions, I do have one more question for you, um, which kind of gets to some of the 21st century challenges of doing satire. So I think one of the reasons why it can be really tricky, we've just sort of talked about this a little bit before, is that the audience tends to be divided, not just by race, but by like those who are in the know, those who are definitely not in the know, and those who think they're in the know, but aren't. And navigating these different audiences can be even more difficult in the 21st century when Black culture is more accessible to non-Black people than ever before. And these challenges remind me of a line in a Paul Beatty book, The Sellout, in which the protagonist says, quote, and there's a lot of foul language here, my apologies in advance, quote, "The Black experience used to come with lots of bullshit, but at least there was some fucking privacy. These days, mainstream America's nose is all up in our business." So if satire offers some protection to Black interiority through inside jokes, plausible deniability, and Black pleasure beyond the white gaze, what happens to that protection when Black cultural privacy gets violated by invasive stares? And in particular, when those invasive stares are by people who can understand the reference but don't know what it means exactly, right? So they've consumed the movie that's being referenced, but they don't fully get the kind of cultural meaning of the movie or what is being said.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is a hard question, and I think that satirists and people who work in satire are still grappling with it right now because um, at at best, nothing happens. You can kind of move past it and acknowledge that the in group got what they needed. They got that sustenance. At worst, it is it would have been better for the satire to have not been undertaken because it's somehow reinforcing the status quo, which is the opposite of what satire is intending to do. Um, and so I think that for a lot of these effective satires in the 21st century, it goes back to kind of what Jordan Peele and Issa Rae in particular have done so well, which is the sense that you can you have to be aware of that the white gaze, or that you have kind of interlopers around without catering to them. So you're trying to kind of do two things at once. Allow viewers who are not in the know to understand a kind of generalized narrative that you're constructing, while also giving the audience that is the in group something to hold on to that feels authentic. Again, the what I like about the Coachella, the Baychella episode of Insecure, where they go to Coachella and they, go to see Beyonce, of course, is that episode, they go to all these parties. It is such a sort of joyful episode in a lot of ways, and they are surrounded by people of color. And there's no kind of conversation about the fact that, oh, we went to Coachella, but we're not hanging out with white folks. It's just they go to Coachella and they hang out with the people that make sense for them to hang out with. And it demonstrates that, while what we see sort of popularly in Coachella is these kind of young, rich, white, young, rich, beautiful white celebrities and their children and things like that, that there is also a space for people of color at Coachella who are also enjoying it. And that is not a lesser space. That is not a space where it's a very, segregated Coachella experience. It just is what it is. And the fact that this was being sort of publicly displayed on HBO without sort of the asterisk of like, look at how clever this is, or look at how different this is, or look at how unusual this Coachella experience is, I think is really powerful. So making sure that these kinds of authentic experiences exist and are being performed and demonstrated without having to put the asterisk by it all the time, I think is really one of the main points.
Yeah. And I think it's a very difficult thing to manage, right? Especially that last group, the people who think they are in the know but actually aren't, because they're more dangerous because they think they get it, and when they don't, the stakes are really high.
Absolutely. And that, I think that's those are the people who are talking to Allison Williams, asking
Right.
why, wasn't Rose a victim all along? Not only do they think they get it, but they think they get it better than,
Right.
people who are seeing the film for what it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that's the kind of dangerous space for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to turn things over to the audience. You have access to the chat, right?
Yes.
So if you want to,
So I want to jump in here, and I know Danielle, you wanted to look, choose and select some questions. So because I had been typing and listing links in the chat, I just pulled out the questions that have already been asked. But if people want to continue to ask and pose questions, whether verbatim or if you would like to write them in the chat, but I have the first three there on the side.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, so I'll just go down the list. The first one I see is I'd love to hear what Dr. Morgan thinks of Sarah Cooper's wonderful lip syncing takedowns of Trump. What is the full significance of her comedy as a Black woman? It's a really great question. She's somebody, first of all, I think I love all of these kinds of internet comedians. I really, really feel like this is the new terrain, not just because of COVID, but also because of just the sort of strange democratization of comedy, that people can sort of rise to the top. And Sarah Cooper is somebody who existed as a comedian prior to these lip syncs, but has really been able to get more worthy attention as a result of being on Twitter and TikTok and all of these things. I think one of the things um, that that makes her comedy so brilliant is twofold. The first is that her facial expressions and her sort of performance of it underscores the meaning we all understand when Trump speaks, that he does not, because of his own sort of persona of unaffected wealth, he doesn't use those same sorts of mannerisms, but what she's doing is underscoring the meaning that we're all gleaning. I
mhm.
think also because she is both Black and a woman, it underscores the white maleness of Trump's entitlement. And I think that, if we've seen people who, dress up like Trump and imitate him, and it may or may not be funny, but what she does that's so brilliant is because she doesn't share these identities with him, right? She doesn't look like him. She doesn't share these identities. And it reminds us of who he is and why it's so dangerous. And I think that's one of the critical pieces of her comedy.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I
Let's
think
see.
Professor Onsworth has kind of two parts.
Two parts. Okay, let's see. Any thoughts on what you think Atlanta brings to the Oh, so that one, let's see. And then wouldn't you say laughter changes minds subconsciously, though? So I say yes to both of those things, both of those great questions. Laughter changes minds subconsciously. I think it can. I think that laughter can be a space, because to laugh means that you get it, ideally, right? That it means ideally you understand. Um, and so if you are able to understand it, then that means that you are accounting for it or allowing some part of it to be true. So yes, I think that oftentimes laughter, depending on the context, depending on the sort of frame, can make that sort of space for changing people's minds, or at least, for better or for worse, allowing somebody to feel like um, they get that they understand the comedian and are sympathetic to the comedian. That's one of the things that makes Dave Chappelle, to go back to him, of course, both so brilliant but also really dangerous, is that his comedic persona and his approachability makes people feel like they know him, even if they don't. And because they feel like they know him, they feel like he's a friend who's kind of talking to them, and they can sort of take his commentary without interrogating it very much. So for better or for worse, laughter can change minds, I think, in a subconscious way. As far as Atlanta, I'm actually working on a project about Atlanta right now, so it's very fresh in my mind. And yes, I think Atlanta is doing an incredible job of not only engaging sort of satire, but the sort of surreality of real life. That for Black people, the status quo is somewhat surreal. And I think by heightening that surreality, they are able to create a really nuanced and thoughtful sort of um, satirical a satirical frame for thinking about what does it look like for young Black people living in a predominantly Black city. What does survival look like in that context? What does thriving look like in that context? We recognize, having seen 2 seasons at least of Atlanta so far, that we weren't expecting Alfred, we aren't expecting Paperboy to become a multimillionaire, but we are hoping that everyone will live and will survive and will find some sense of self-actualization and hope, and that the stakes, I think, are different as a result. And I think underscoring that kind of um, reality for a lot of young Black people is where that satire emerges.
Mhm.
Yeah. Let's see.
And there's one more question from Professor Green.
Let's see. With the numerous Black British actors, actresses being cast in Black American roles, what are your thoughts on the argument that this is a version of performative Blackness, particularly when these actors are playing stereotypical Black Americans? This is a great question, because I was actually thinking about this recently with Daniel Kaluuya in particular, because he just played Fred Hampton. And I was wondering, while I liked the film very much, I was wondering what it might have looked like if someone younger had played Hampton, because I think that's a really critical point that gets missed, is that Fred Hampton was 21 when he was murdered. I also think that as charismatic as Daniel Kaluuya is, that Fred Hampton was just unbelievably charismatic, and I can't think of somebody who could have matched that level of charisma. But to the point of, I think that's related to the question of performative Blackness. I believe it was Samuel L. Jackson saying that there's something about being Black and American and playing these roles that allows you to sort of engage, or to sort of become these characters without it feeling as performed. And so my short answer is, I'm not entirely sure of how I feel about it at present. I do find it interesting to note that in a lot of these kinds of big roles for that are specifically Black American characters, that we're seeing a lot of Black British actors, and I'm not sure what to make of that. Because obviously there is a great deal of overlap between the Black British experience and the Black American experience, but they are not the same. I don't want to say that people shouldn't be allowed to perform roles in that kind of way, at least in that context. I don't think, but I also feel like um, it's something that we need to be thinking about more. What that means if we are saying that the Black American experience, um, what does it mean, and how will we look back on this particular moment in time if the Black American experience is never portrayed by Black Americans? And that is a question I can't answer yet, but I am really interested in thinking about that more, for sure.
There are a couple other questions that we maybe can do one more. So it looks like Joe Green and Maggie Leventovskaya has one too.
I'll just go in order. So let's see. I'm trying to think if I can kind of combine these two questions, but I don't think I can. I wonder, I'll push back a little bit against the question about the feminization, because what I'm seeing now is a lot of sort of overt performative masculinization from a lot of comedians right now. I think especially even on Saturday Night Live, Kenan Thompson has refused for the past maybe 8 years, something like that, to perform in drag. And I think that a lot of these, I think because with the exception of Tyler Perry in the 80s and 90s, there were so many, and especially in the 90s, there were so many sort of drag, sort of shallow, what I'll say shallow and nuanced performances of Black men as women, that a lot of these comedians are sort of refusing to do that anymore. And not because they're saying that Black women should have the roles, but because of a sort of, again, sort of shallow understanding of what performing as a woman means or represents. And so I think that instead of, I don't think Black millennials are conditioned to think that they have to be feminine in that kind of way, but I am concerned that they are thinking the same thing that has been thought for quite a long time, that women aren't funny, or that women can't be funny unless it's in particular spaces, right?
Yeah, and there's also been some performances that are clearly a bit anti-trans as well, right? Or anti-drag queen as in particular too. So I'm thinking back to like, especially I like Jamie Foxx a lot, but some of the stuff he did in Living Color was
absolutely
off color. In retrospect, I would say for sure.
Yeah, and I think that I think that the anti-transness is really, really critical. And I am hoping that some of the resistance to perform these characters, because Kenan Thompson never said it specifically. I know he did say like, y'all need to hire some Black women instead. But I'm hoping that some of this resistance is now in view of not trying to be anti-trans. And for Maggie's question, what I'll say very briefly is I am hoping that some of those kinds of conversations will be addressed in this new movie, which I am super excited about. But I'm hoping that some of the questionable, Arsenio Hall as, masculine woman, and that's inherently funny, will be remedied in this new movie.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for a really wonderful conversation. I hope everyone can, and it's weird to clap on virtual spaces, but thank you very much.
so
we
much.
really appreciated you taking the time to come and speak to us. And hopefully sometime you can come to our actual campus.
I would
Uh,
love
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And I did throw in up the links for it's the book Laughing to Keep from Dying. And apparently the link to the Google Doc I need to make it public. So I will do that. But you can, if you click on it, I will make it public so you can actually access all the links that way too. Thank you all very much. And I hope you all have a great evening.